This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. I think it's been almost exactly a year and 2 months since I first got a Gibson Les Paul. Now, up until this point, and I was, 33 at the time, I had never really owned a Gibson Les Paul. I had had a Tokai Les Paul for a brief period of time, which I didn't play too much. And I think for any guitarist, sort of like lifelong guitarist, I would say that at some point, this is what me and David Beebe sort of decided together, that I think at some point it's worth owning one of these just to kind of, tap into a little bit of history, tap into, understanding what it is to play a Les Paul. For me, it took me quite a while to sort of get acclimatized to it. And particularly what helped was sort of taking a week off any other instrument and sort of focusing on the Les Paul for a good week. If you put them away for a while, I think you can then sort of forget what it's like to play them again. Unless, of course, you are a Les Paul person, which myself personally, I'm a bit more of a Strat-based player. But the Les Paul, I think, I'd just recommend giving it sort of a try. This one was made in 2002, which basically you find any year somewhere online someone is saying that this is a good year for Les Pauls. 2002 is no exception to that, but I think that the reality probably is that there are good and bad and medium Les Pauls in kind of every era of Gibson, and it's probably a case of trying to sort of luck out and find one that kind of speaks to you. And I think for me the Les Paul is quite an aesthetic instrument. What I'm looking at is probably just as important as how it sounds. For me, David Beebe's Les Paul, which is also a 2002, has a 60s neck. I felt like the slightly wider, less uniform flame on that top spoke to me a bit more. This one's quite a sort of tight, uniform flame. They're all kind of really variable in the tops. Another huge place that they can vary is weight-wise. Now, for me, what I'd really like, so Jake's Les Paul Murphy Lab is like £8, £8.6, between £8.2, £8.6. Those feel really comfortable to play, or that one in specific does. Doesn't sort of kill your leg or anything. This one's about £1 heavier than that, and yeah, if you go through the years, basically Gibson, past the 80s, started to drill out bits of the guitars and stuff. I think their more recent Les Paul standards aren't treated in the same way. I think those are all solid mahogany again. One of the key differences with the more recent Gibson Les Pauls, though, is that the fret job, I think they're using a plec in the factory, and the frets do end up being, I think, quite a lot more flatter, less tall, shorter. You know the words. But that Gary Moore greeny Les Paul that I played did play really well, and I thought sounded really good. So I think when you're buying a Les Paul, for me, what I'm looking for is, do I like the look of it, and then do I like the way that it plays, and do I like the weight of it? Like the weight of a guitar you can't really change, so if it's a super heavy guitar but the top looks nice, which is basically what that greeny sort of was, then probably you're gonna not play it as much as if it was, not necessarily quite as good looking, but had a nice kind of giggable weight. Another thing that I did with this guitar, so this initially came with the Alnico /2 pickups, which some people really like. I felt like they didn't have too much life to them. They were a little bit flat. I really like the stock burst buckers, but these are the Monty's underspun paths, and I quite like these because they gave it a little bit closer to that sort of single coil voice that I like. So these are a little bit kind of like a fatter single coil rather than being sort of these super hot pickups. For me, I think my impression was that Les Pauls are kind of these rock machines, and that they're going to have these high output pickups, and if you change those out for some lighter and more vintage style, softer pickups, you can do a ton with a Les Paul. Obviously, it's not a one-trick pony at all. Kind of mid-gain thing I'm really liking, particularly if you sort of back the neck pickup off a bit. I have played as well. I tried to buy a R8 that came up, and for me it didn't really look different enough to justify than this one, and that for me was one of the key factors that I decided that a Les Paul would have to sort of beat this in looks if I was going to buy another one. The Epiphone Lazarus that I have as well, I don't think is a step down in quality at all from this, so I would totally recommend looking at and trying some of those. Those actually have a long tenon neck join as well, and you're not really getting a worse guitar. I think if you just, you know, play a few of them and play a few Gibsons, you might be pleasantly surprised that you can get a really good Les Paul without paying sort of the 2,000, 2,300 that a Les Paul Standard is in the UK at the moment. Also, Tokai makes some really good stuff. I've just seen as well that Maybach have some really interesting looking guitars. I've not played one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you've tried a Maybach, but those look the part, and they seem to be slightly lighter than your average Gibson. As well as the Eastmans. I'm hearing really good things about those. I'm going to try and grab one of those if I can find one for a good price to review on the channel. But basically, I've got this one out of the cupboard, and I kind of thought, well, that's totally doing the Les Paul thing, and it's totally acceptable, totally playable, stays in tune, sounds really good, plays really well. This has got the 50s neck, which is my preferred neck. I think the 60s for me is a bit too flat, and then, you know, playing wise doesn't necessarily agree with my hand too much. The main thing that I notice on the Les Paul coming from a Strat is that when you play your kind of unwound strings up at the top, it's not getting thin, it's kind of staying thick and juicy. And that's, I guess, part of what people really like about a Les Paul. Sounds great clean as well, a nice kind of thick, throaty voice to the Les Paul. So yeah, definitely I would recommend trying one if you can get your hands on, you know, a few and find one that speaks to you. I think a Les Paul kind of has a home with most guitarists, unless, again, you might totally not get on with them at all. But I think if you give them a bit of a chance, they can be a beautiful thing. I've not had a ton of experience with the modern kind of Gibson Les Paul Standard. I feel like a Les Paul Standard from 2 decades ago, plenty of them about, worth giving a shot on the used market, I think. Particularly sort of around 2000 to 2005, you can find them, and you know, if you can get one in relatively decent condition, you're never going to lose money on it, presumably, unless you drop it from 2 centimeters and break the headstock. Kind of, I was encouraged to get this out of the cupboard because I was listening to Joe Bonamassa and some other folks on Corey Wong's podcast talk about gear and stuff, and it sort of just reminded me that the guitar doesn't really have a story without you. And what makes sort of the Gary Moore, Peter Green, Greenie interesting to me is not the guitar itself, it's that Gary Moore played it. And likewise, then when you realise that Still Got the Blues wasn't even recorded on that guitar, it was recorded on a later 59 that he got called Stripe. And you think, actually, what I'm interested in is the guy who's playing that guitar rather than the guitar itself. And probably Gary Moore would have sounded just as good playing this Les Paul Standard. You know, if you stick those kind of specific types of pickups in it, pretty much any Les Paul, I reckon you probably find a little bit of magic if you put it into the hands of Gary Moore or someone like that. And I've also heard a few people say this, and I think Jake has played one of the kind of famous 59s. He's played a few 59s, and he said they're not necessarily the most special guitars ever. I think what makes them special always is the player. So there's something to try and kind of remind yourself that, you know, necessarily having the most expensive Les Paul or Les Paul variant doesn't necessarily, you know, complete the story. It's you that makes that thing work. Anyway, so yeah, I thought worth having a Gibson Les Paul in the house for sure. I'm using the Eric Lead 2023 preset here. I'm going to go through that at a later stage because it's the one that I've been using most at the moment. So watch out for that. But in the Gumroad is where you can grab my presets if you wanted to.